Hi guys, we are going to start reading for 3rd through 5th grade James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. Before we get started, I have to tell you that I looked at the little card in this, because we always love to look at the cards and see who checked them out. And back on March 11th in 2005, Miss Geroder checked this book out when she was in 4th grade, and now she is a 4th grade teacher in our building. So I thought that was funny and certainly worth sharing. So I'm going to read a little bit of this, and then I'm going to give you a little activity that you can do at home to go along with it. James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl. Here is James Henry Trotter when he was about 4 years old. Up until this time, he had a happy life, living peacefully with his mother and his father in a beautiful house beside the sea. There were always plenty of other children for him to play with, and there was a sandy beach for him to run about on, and the ocean to paddle in. It was the perfect life for a small boy. Then one day, James's mother and father went to London to do some shopping, and there was a terrible thing that happened. Both of them suddenly got eaten up, in full daylight, mind you, on a crowded street by an enormous, angry rhinoceros who had escaped from the London Zoo. Now this, as you can imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents. But in the long run, it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were all over in a jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast, unfriendly world. The lovely house by the seaside had been sold immediately, and the little boy, carrying nothing but a small suitcase containing a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush, was sent away to live with his two aunts. Their names were Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and I am sorry to say that they were both really horrible people. They were selfish and lazy and cruel, and right from the beginning they started beating poor James for almost no reason at all. They never called him by his real name, but they always referred to him as "you disgusting little beast," or "you filthy nuisance," or "you miserable creature." And they certainly never gave him any toys to play with or any picture books to look at. His room was as bare as a prison cell. They lived, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and now James as well, in a weird little ramshackle house on the top of a hill in the south of England. The hill was so high that almost from anywhere in the garden, James could look down and see for miles and miles across the marvelous landscape of woods and fields. And on a very clear day, if he looked in the right direction, he could see a tiny gray dot in the faraway horizon, which was the house that he once lived in with his beloved mother and father. So here's a picture of James and his suitcase, and this is a picture of Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. You decide which one you think is Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker. We'll find out later. And just beyond that, he could see the ocean itself, a long, thin streak of blackish blue, like a line of ink beneath the rim of a sky. But James was never allowed to go down off the top of that hill. Neither Aunt Sponge nor Aunt Spiker could even be bothered to take him out herself, not even for a small walk or a picnic, and he certainly wasn't permitted to go alone. "That nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes out in the garden," Aunt Spiker had said, and terrible punishments were promised to him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week if he even so much as dared to climb over the fence. The garden, which covered the whole top of the hill, was large and desolate, and the only tree in the entire place, apart from a clump of dirty old laurel bushes at the far end, was an ancient peach tree that had never given any peaches. There was no swing, no seesaw, no sand pit, and no other children were ever invited to come up the hill to play with poor James. There wasn't so much as a dog or a cat around to keep him company, and as time went on, he became sadder and sadder, and the more and more lonely he got. He used to spend hours every day standing at the bottom of the garden, gazing wistfully at the lovely but forbidden world of woods and fields and ocean that was spread out below him like a magic carpet. Here is Henry James Trotter after he had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, which was when this story really begins. For now there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which I say was only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar. And then the very peculiar thing in its own turn caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to happen. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker and James were all out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in their deck chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade and watching him to see that he didn't stop work for one moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy eyes and a sunken mouth and one of those white flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was like a great white soggy overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spiker, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed on the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice and a long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come shooting out of her mouth as she talked. And there they sat, these two ghastly hags, sipping their drinks and every now and again screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each one saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror in her lap, and she kept picking it up and gazing at her own hideous face. "I look and smell," Aunt Sponge declared, "as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face and observe my shapely nose. Behold my heavenly silky locks, and if I take off both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget," Aunt Spiker cried, "how much your tummy shows." Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Spiker said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth and charming chin. Oh, beautiful me, how I adore my radiant looks, and please ignore the pimple on my chin." Oh dear old trout," Aunt Sponge cried out, "you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I possess can only truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared. "Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I'd capture all the nation's hearts. They'd give me all the leading parts. The stars would all resign. I think you'd make," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. The heat was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arms were aching. The chopper was a huge, blunt thing, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding tricycles in their gardens. Some would be walking in cool woods and picking up bunches of wildflowers. And all those little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheek. He stopped working and he leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed with his own happiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Auntie Sponge," James cried out, "and Auntie Spiker, couldn't we all please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far. And I feel so hot and awful lonely." "Why, you lazy good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him," called Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will," Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on in the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now you get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind the clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we mentioned earlier on. Then he covered his face with his hands and he began to cry and cry. It was at this point, the first thing of all, the rather peculiar thing that led to so many other much more peculiar things happened to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard the rustle of leaves, and he turned around and he saw an old man in a crazy dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, but he had a rather huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning on his stick and staring hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very slow and creaky. "Come closer to me, little boy," he said, beckoning for James with his finger. "Come right up close to me. I will show you something wonderful." James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then he put a hand into the pocket of his jacket, and he took out a small white paper bag. "You see this?" he whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of James's face. "You know what this is, my dear? You know what's inside this little bag?" Then he came nearer still, leaning forward, pushing his face so close to James that James could feel his breath blowing on his cheeks. The breath smelled musty and stale and slightly mildewed, like air in an old cellar. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag, tilting it toward James. Inside of it, James could see a mass of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals. Each one was about the size of a grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness about them, a sort of luminous quality that had made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. "Listen to them," the old man whispered. "Listen to them move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling coming up from inside of it, and when he noticed that all the thousands of little green things were slowly, very slowly stirring about and moving over each other as if they were alive. "There's more power and magic in these things than in all the rest of the world put together," the old man said softly. But, what are they?" James murmured, finding his voice at last. "Where do they come from?" "Aha," whispered the old man. "You'd never guess that." He was crouching a little now and pushing his face still closer and closer to James until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the skin of James's forehead. And then suddenly he jumped back and he began waving his stick madly in the air. "Crocodile tongues," he cried. 1,000 long, slimy crocodile tongues boiled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days, and nights with the eyeballs of a lizard, and the fingers of a young monkey, and the gizzards of a pig, and the beak of a green parrot, and the juice of a porcupine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew them for another week and let the moon do the rest." All at once he pushed the white paper bag into James's hands and he said, "Here, you take it. It's yours." James Henry Trotter stood there clutching the bag and staring at the old man. "And now," said the old man, "all you've got to do is this. Take a large jug of water and pour all the little green things into it, and then very, very slowly, one by one, add 10 hairs from your own head, and that sets them off. It gets them going. In a couple of minutes, the water will begin to froth and bubble furiously. As soon as that happens, you must quickly drink it all down, the whole jugful in one gulp. And then, my dear, you will feel it churning and boiling in your stomach, and steam will start to come out of your mouth. And immediately after that, marvelous things will start happening to you, fabulous, unbelievable things. And you will never be miserable again in your life, because you are miserable, aren't you? You needn't tell me. I know all about it. Now off you go and do exactly as I say, and don't whisper a word of this to those 2 horrible aunts of yours. Not a word. And don't let those green things in there get away from you either, because if they do escape, then they will be working their magic upon somebody else instead of upon you. And if that isn't what you want at all, is it, my dear? Whoever they meet first, be it a bug, an insect, an animal, or a tree, that will be the one who gets the full power of their magic. So hold on to the bag tight. Don't tear the paper. Off you go. Hurry up. Don't wait. Now's the time. Hurry." And with that, the old man turned away and disappeared into the bushes. At the next moment, James was running back toward the house as fast as he could go. He would do it all in the kitchen, he told himself, if only he could get to where Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker couldn't see him. He was terribly excited. He flew through the long grass and the stinging nettles, not caring whether he got stung or not on his bare knees, and in the distance he could see Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker sitting in their chairs with their backs to him. He swerved away from them so as to go around the other side of the house, but then suddenly, as he was passing underneath that old peach tree that stood in the middle of the garden, his foot slipped and he fell flat on his face in the grass. The paper bag burst open. It hit the ground, and thousands of tiny green things were scattered in all directions. James immediately picked himself up onto his hands and knees and started searching around for his precious treasures. But what was this? They were all sinking into the soil. He could actually see them wiggling and twisting as they burrowed down toward the hard earth. And at once he reached out a hand to pick up some of them before it was too late, but they disappeared right under his fingers. He went after some others, and the same thing happened. He began scrabbling around frantically in an effort to catch hold of those that were left, but they were too quick for him. Each time the tips of his fingers were just about to touch them, they vanished into the earth. And soon, in the space of only a few seconds, every single one of them had gone. James felt like crying. He would never get them back now. They were lost forever. But where had they gone? And why in the world had they been so eager to push down into Earth like that? What were they after? There was nothing down there, nothing except the roots of the old peach tree, and a whole lot of earthworms and centipedes and insects living in the soil. But what was it the old man had said? Whoever they meet first, be it a bug, insect, animal, or tree, that would be the one who gets the full power of their magic? Good heavens, thought James, what was going to happen? In that case, if they do meet an earthworm or a centipede or a spider, and what if they do get to the roots of the peach tree? Get up at once, you lazy little beast! A voice was suddenly shouting in James's ear. James glanced up and saw Aunt Spiker standing over him, grim and tall and bony, glaring at him through her steel-rimmed spectacles. Get back over there immediately and you finish chopping up those logs, she ordered. Aunt Sponge, fat and pulpy as a jellyfish, came waddling up behind her sister to see what was going on. Why don't we just lower that boy down the well in a bucket and leave him there for the night, she suggested. That ought to teach him not to laze around like this the whole day long. That's a very good wheeze, my dear Sponge, but let's make him finish chopping the wood first. Be off with you at once, you hideous brat, and do some work. Slowly and sadly, poor James got up off the ground and went back to the woodpile. Oh, if only he hadn't slipped and fallen and dropped that precious bag. All hope of a happier life had gone completely now. Today and tomorrow and the next day and all the other days as well would be nothing but punishment and pain and unhappiness and despair. He picked up the chopper and was just about to start chopping away when he heard a shout behind him that made him stop and turn. All right, that's where I'm going to stop today. And what I would like you to do is try to predict what you think is going to happen now in this story. We just heard a scream behind him. We know that he lost the magical little like bean things that the man had given him. So I want you to make a prediction. And when we start reading tomorrow, we'll see if your prediction is correct.